We'll now hear from Mr. Morrison, please, for 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the chance to appear. 81 years ago, a Conservative Prime Minister introduced public broadcasting in Canada. 59 years later, a Progressive Conservative Prime Minister updated the Broadcasting Act for the 21st century.
229 of Bill C-60 would apply certain new provisions of the Financial Administration Act, FAA, to the CBC, giving the Cabinet the right to direct the Treasury Board that it must approve CBC's negotiating mandate for any collective agreement and impose any requirement on that mandate. Further, a Treasury Board employee might attend and observe the collective bargaining process. No collective bargaining could be entered into by the CBC without Treasury Board approval. The principal financial provisions relating to the CBC are set out in the Broadcasting Act, sections 52 to 70. They reflect a decision by Parliament to treat the CBC differently than other Crown agencies, subject to the FAA. In particular, the FAA's direction and control provisions do not apply to the CBC. In so doing, Parliament followed recommendations by the Common Standing Committee on Communications and Culture and the government's own policy paper entitled Canadian Voices, Canadian Choices, a New Broadcasting Policy for Canada. The Standing Committee's report expressed the nub of this issue succinctly, and I'm quoting, "The CBC should remain exempt from the power of direction provisions which are applicable to other Crown corporations under the Financial Administration Act, and from other provisions which would compromise the arm's-length relationship of the CBC to the government." Part 3 of the Broadcasting Act sets out the provisions of CBC's mandate within the Canadian broadcasting system. Each of these is outlined on page 2 of a letter of opinion by Brian MacLeod Rogers, one of Canada's most distinguished and renowned media lawyers, who is with me here today. Mr. Rogers, back here. Friends has commissioned this opinion and has tabled the letter with the clerk of your committee this morning. Sections 35 and 52 of the Broadcasting Act are extremely clear in their direction that the CBC's editorial independence is an imperative that requires CBC to be treated differently than other Crown agencies. For example, Section 35(2) states that all the provisions of Part 3, quote, shall be interpreted and applied so as to protect and enhance the freedom of expression and the journalistic, creative, and programming independence enjoyed by the corporation in the pursuit of its objects and in the exercise of its powers. The Broadcasting Act's fundamental requirement that CBC must maintain an arm's-length distance from government and be protected from possible governmental interference, as well as that the public should perceive that the CBC is independent, are not reflected in the C-60 proposals. Mr. Rogers' letter of opinion makes clear that there is a conflict between the carefully protected special status of the CBC under the Broadcasting Act and the proposed provisions of the FAA that seek to impose direct control by Treasury Board on all aspects of CBC's employment relations. After all, concludes Mr. Rogers, it is all too possible that government's levers of power, particularly its exercise of financial control, could be used in the future to shape, diminish, and even threaten the CBC's role as the public broadcaster. And the CBC's management and employees may find themselves affected in myriad and subtle ways in order to curry the government's favour or avoid its displeasure. Mr. Rogers concludes that the inherent conflict between the two statutes will require judicial determination to reconcile the apparent conflict between them. We recommend that the government steer clear of that morass by removing the CBC from Bill C-60, or failing that, making the clauses referencing CBC subject to the protection from interference afforded to sections 35(2) and 52 of the Broadcasting Act. Monsieur le Président, j'ai aussi distribué aujourd'hui
Mr. Speaker, I have also distributed today, through the clerk, copies in both official languages of a letter to the Prime Minister on this matter signed by a number of Canada's most eminent authorities on democratic journalism, which they have copied to members of your committee. And I would like to add the name of Mr. Bernard de Rome, who signed the letter last evening. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison.
To Mr. Morrison, now, I understand from the Canadian Media Guild, maybe you can help clarify this, that the collective agreement at the CBC is not just about wages and benefits, but that it contains clauses to help ensure journalistic integrity for Canada's largest journalistic organization. That includes strict conflict of interest rules that ensures that CBC journalists act in the public interest, that journalists are protected from political interference with their work, and to ensure that journalists don't have to fear retribution for stories that they may cover politicians of the day, and that the Treasury Board's interference could undermine these measures. Is the CBC's independence based on these kinds of collective agreement provisions essential to its performance as a journalistic entity?
I would put it this way. The statutory basis for the CBC's independence enables collective bargaining that creates conditions of work that defend the autonomy of journalists. For example, a journalist cannot be just pulled off a story without a reason. A producer has the right to refuse to produce something if for some reason they feel they're being pressured. There are a whole range of examples. You'll find a list contained in the letter to the Prime Minister that has been circulated this morning,
yes,
that are the practical expression of the journalistic independence. And the threat to that is that if the government of the day, controlling a Treasury Board employee, gets into the position of approving such matters, there's a danger of interference and a collapse of the whole basis of the independence.
Mm-hmm. So while we have a public broadcaster, its integrity and independence has been assured by this arm's length entity, and it has been not only in its collective agreement, but in the statutes controlling that entity.
And I would add one thing, Ms. Nash, and that is we know of no other national public broadcaster in any Western democracy, any OECD country, that has any provisions where the government of the day can interfere in the conditions of work of its journalists.
Very important. Mm-hmm. Now, as I understand it, this new attack on the CBC comes after significant budget cuts over the years by both successive Liberal and Conservative governments. I have been contacted by thousands of constituents in my riding over the years about these cuts. Can you tell me what impact this has had on the CBC?
Just a brief response, Mr. Morrison.
What impact the cuts have had on the CBC?
Well, when you get cuts, what you get is a decline in what is called production values. And it happens particularly, Ms. Nash, in smaller centres, not so much in your constituency, but in rural Alberta, for example, or northern British Columbia, or rural Newfoundland.
Mr. Bryson, for your round.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance appeared before the committee, and I quoted excerpts from the letter we've received from Hubert Lacroix, the president of CBC, where essentially the president of CBC threatens to sue the government if the budget bill C-60 passes as it is. And in that letter, he also said that the budget bill would reduce the independence that is critical to our operation, and that it could potentially embroil the government, our corporation, and its unions in litigation, a result that could be avoided with an amendment that protects that independence. So I simply ask the Minister, would you support an amendment to your budget bill that protects the independence of the CBC so that we can avoid a court battle between the government and the CBC? And the minister responded, the CBC may think that it's a special part of a Crown agency. That is wrong, or rather this is wrong. All the Crown agencies have a responsibility through ministers back to Parliament, to the people of Canada. Do you disagree, or would you agree or disagree with the minister that the CBC is distinct from other Crown corporations?
Mr. Bryson, it doesn't really matter what I think. That's the law of the land, as I've quoted in my presentation, and there are good reasons for it, and it was, of course, under Mr. Mulroney's government that those reasons were advanced into law.
Yes.
But more important
that
than
was a progressive conservative government. It's quite distinct.
Oh, you're even more familiar with it than I am, sir. But I just want to say that the government has ample control over the national public broadcaster. I use the word control advisedly, influence, through control of the amount of public funds it receives. Something like 70% of its revenues come from the Canadian taxpayer, and also through total control of appointments of its board of directors and its chief executive officer. And the arm's length principle, as I mentioned previously to Ms. Nash, is pretty important, and you cannot find an example in another free and democratic country of any proposition like the one that the Bill C-60 would have on the CBC. It's just not acceptable.
Thank you very much, and thank you for helping familiarize the government members with the law of the land on this issue. I think it's particularly important and helpful to edify all members of Parliament, and I'll make sure that the message gets back to the minister as well as part of this ongoing pedagogy.
Arguments. I'd like to go to Mr. Morrison now. On a entendu hier le ministre.
Yesterday, we heard from Minister Flaherty, and he said something in response to my colleague's question from Ms. Nash. She asked if the provisions on Crown corporations would have a negative effect on Canada Post, Radio-Canada, CBC, on the Investment Bureau, Pension Investment Bureau. These are all organizations who, by definition, have to be at arm's length. And she gave examples in how journalists, reporters, researchers at the Bank of Canada, for example, could be affected. The answer was?
Ça, c'était sa réponse mot pour mot. Est-ce qu'on a besoin d'entrer?
That was his response. So are we going to end up in a dictatorship in terms of the impact on the arm's length nature of information at CBC?
Broadcasting is, throughout the world, accompanies democracy. There are no free and democratic countries without public broadcasters. Some are stronger, some are weaker, but that is the case. And so my answer to you is that I think I would urge the minister to reflect on this matter. I do not ascribe any motive to the government. Others can do that. I'm just concerned with the result. And an unfortunate result, as is described in the rather articulate letter to the Prime Minister that has been circulated, the result is the threat of losing something very important in the democratic fabric of Canada, not instantly, but gradually, and we will live to regret it. It's unnecessary, and it's also undesirable.
Mr. Morrison, a scenario, let's say a CBC journalist is writing a story on the Senate scandal, and the Treasury Board orders that journalist to be moved from full-time to part-time. Is that a possible scenario as a consequence of Bill C-60?
I think it's a bit far-fetched, but it doesn't require that scenario to be accurate for all of the concerns I have expressed to be valid.
Okay. Now, Mr. Morrison, I have had the opportunity of reading your letter. I noticed that out of the 13 people that signed the letter, 8 were journalists, mostly with CBC, 4 were academics, and 1 was an American journalist. I'm not sure if they get CBC in Oregon, but I'm not sure why they would have signed it.
distinguished Canadian journalist who's working in Oregon.
In Oregon, yeah. I went down to Oregon for a while and did a Bachelor of Science degree there. It's a beautiful city. It's fantastic. I wasn't really sure why he signed it in that particular place. But what I was interested
endeavor to find out and
what
get back to
what
you.
I'm interested in is in particular whether or not I watch CBC. I watch it every day. I watch it a lot. Do you watch CTV and Sun Media?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I do as well. I watch them, all three of them. I watch them in Quebec for the most part because that's where I live when I'm in Ottawa doing the people that I represent's business in Northern Alberta. And I watch all three, Channel 18, 63, and 79, and I do not discriminate between any of them. I try to watch them all because I want to know what's going on. I notice there's no friends of CTV or Sun Media here today, but I'm just wondering if you...
here today either. We are an
Mr.
independent
Morrison, this is my
organization.
This is my opportunity to ask questions, and I don't have
Appropriate,
Mr.
Mr.
Morrison, I said a particular statement in relation to CTV and Sun. It had nothing to do with your appearance here today. What I'm asking is, do you oppose the same funding for CTV and for Sun Media per capita as CBC receives?
Yes.
And why do you oppose it?
They are private television networks. They compete with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, whose English language network is 60% funded by advertising. But they have nothing to do with public radio, such as, for example, the station that Ms. McLeod referred to a few minutes ago.
I have public radio by CBC up in Fort McMurray in that area as well, so I understand. Now, would you suggest on a per-watcher basis for TV alone, on public broadcasting for CBC, should that be treated equally between CBC, CTV, and Sun? Should they receive the same money per capita? For instance, I don't listen to CBC radio, but I watch all three of the channels on an equal basis. Should each of them receive equal funding for what I watch because I am a taxpayer?
No.
So CBC should be treated distinctly different, even though they have the same carriage of the same product for the same people.
The difference is that one of the principal differences, Mr. Jean, is that in prime time they are delivering Canadians Canadian programming, whereas the other networks you mention are buying Hollywood programming and wrapping Canadian ads around it.
I guess
that's where their revenue is.
The difference is I only watch news pretty much because that's what I need to keep track of. Mr. Carlton,
you have that in common with many politicians.
Very quickly,